Welcome to the Pacific Southwest MHGTC's webinar on commemoration and memorialization in school settings. It's so wonderful to see you here and have you on the line with us. My name is Leora. I'm the School Mental Health Lead for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC. And as folks are signing, as many of you know, we are a project of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. And we want to acknowledge and be grateful for the funding and also acknowledge that the content doesn't always necessarily represent the views expressed by SAMHSA. And many of you are new to us and many of you are old friends of us, of the TTC network. So this is where, for those of you on the line, you might be like, well, that's a very tiny font. So I wanted to say a couple things about this slide. One is that we are a project of SAMHSA, so we're Region 9. You'll see on the left-hand side. We serve the Pacific Islands, the U.S. Pacific Islands, Hawaii, which we've got some folks on from Hawaii, Arizona, which I saw some Arizonans in the house, Nevada, strong with us today, and also California. We are colleagues of all of our other MHGTCs across the country. So even if you're not from our region, you can absolutely, like many of you are doing, coming to our webinars and our trainings, we all service each other. So I just want to name that. And then you'll also note that there is a blue and orange and green box. So every region has a mental health technology transfer center, which is what we are. We're the green. There's a addiction technology transfer center and a prevention technology transfer center. So sorry, we're the orange. So if you haven't connected with your local TTC, either for addiction, prevention, or mental health, please let us know, and we're happy to do that. The voice that you're hearing is Leora. My name is Leora, and I'm the School Mental Health Lead for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, so that kind of like rusty sienna, the bottom left-hand side in Region 9. And I am really glad to have you with us. I'm going to move forward. So if you're not familiar with the MHTTCs, we are a semi-new structure of SAMHSA. So we are completely open access. So you don't have to be a part of a grant or an initiative to engage with us and to get support from us. And we're really here to support the mental health workforce, and particularly for our initiative, the school mental health workforce. And we define the school mental health workforce as anyone who supports the mental health of folks who work with and in schools. So it's pretty broad. I will note that for us in our region, we have two strands, two areas of concentration. One is the intersection of school mental health leadership and literacy, so kind of increasing that bilingualism between mental health professionals and educators at the school site and with school partnerships. And then we have the second track, which is focusing on school crisis, readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. And that is actually the track that this webinar is coming out of, because we know that many folks in our region are really dedicated to thinking about not only how to prepare, but also how to respond, and then also how to create healing-centered school practices so that our schools can be the platforms for community healing and also for really supporting everyone to make meaning of the lived realities that we're grappling with. So we do that by providing webinars like the one that you're on, also by providing regional trainings, which hopefully we'll be able to get back in person with you soon, but we're moving many of our trainings to virtual, as many of you are familiar with. And we provide individual coaching and consultation, so you can always ping me if you in your district needs a specific need, and we'll make sure to figure that out and respond to you. And also lots of tools, and we hope that you sign up for our newsletter so you can get all the resources and products that we're working on for you. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is well, I don't think I'd mentioned this before, so I want to mention it now, that this webinar comes out of the track for crisis readiness, response, renewal, and recovery and renewal for school mental health leadership. And our partner in that track is the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, of which we have Dr. David Schoenfeld, who will be presenting today. And this is the first of a three-part series, and it's not sequential, so you can come to this and then come to the next one and the one after that. And also, if your colleagues aren't able to come today, they can absolutely come to the one in May and in August. So today, we're really focusing our thoughts and intentions around the principles of commemoration and memorialization. And in May, we'll be looking and exploring the intersections and also diversions of grief-sensitive and trauma-informed approaches to schools. And then in August. And I want to note, for those of you on the line as you're joining us, that this was a lineup that Dr. Schoenfeld, that we and Dr. Schoenfeld had actually developed before the pandemic. Because we know that many of us were already and before supporting grief in schools and supporting schools to really support grief navigation. And now even all the more so. So all that to say, I think many of you have heard that my kind of adage this whole time period has been, why this, why now, both the always and the now. So the commemoration and memorialization piece that David is bringing to us today, Dr. Schoenfeld is bringing to us today, was set up even before the pandemic and may have contextual and heightened need during the pandemic. And so for us, we want to continue the learning, not in spite of the context that we're moving through, but in light of it, and also really paying attention to what our needs were before this and what our needs will be after this, so we can continue to build our competencies and our skills and our knowledge around supporting grief-sensitive school leadership. I also want to note, before I hand it over to David, that in terms of our work here at the MHTC, one of the pieces that we really want to pay attention to is not only what supports we need to provide for our students, but also concentric circles. So how does this work impact us, and how does this work impact those we work with? So it's really thinking about, for us as leaders and managers, how we are also engaged and involved in this experience of grief and sensitive school navigation. The part of commemoration and memorialization, of course, is thinking about best practices and also pieces to consider as you move forward. But I just want to name that many of us on the line are navigating our own experiences with grief or with trauma or with stress and with deep healing and resilience in the context of the pandemic and also before the pandemic and after. So I want to acknowledge you and your colleagues and your students for all the vicarious resilience that you're building and contributing to in this time period. So the other piece that I want to just offer before we get started is that many of us can talk about grief and commemorization and memorialization and death and dying in schools and have it be something that feels very separate from our own experience. But I also want to acknowledge that many of us have lost students on the line, we've lost colleagues on the line, and so I want to invite you that we believe that we all hold three hats in any experience of learning. We hold the hat of us as a person and as a human in our learning. We hold the hat of us as a professional, how this applies to my work. And then we hold a hat of us as a facilitator or a trainer, right? Like, oh, how might use this content in my own leadership work. And we believe that from a transformational space, the best and most pivotal work happens when we really sit in the how is this impacting me as a human, and then also me as an employer, as an employee. So I just wanted to offer those three hats for any of you during this time period to kind of like see which hat you're sitting in. Are you processing it as a you, or are you processing it as an employee? And just give yourself space to process however you would like to. And we're going to take a couple moments during the presentation to connect and reflect. And then we'll end the presentation with some Q&A, and we'll close. So all that to say, before I hand it over to Dr. Schoenfeld, again, the voice you're hearing, my name is Leora. I'm the School Mental Health Lead for the MHTC Pacific Southwest. The handout and presentation are in the pod right above the chat. Please feel free to put questions, comments, and resources in the chat box as Dr. Schoenfeld is presenting. I'm going to be monitoring and responding. And I also am really wanting to invite you to support any kind of regulation you need during this discussion. So all that to say, welcome. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the proverbial baton to Dr. Schoenfeld.
All right. Well, thank you, Leora. So, what I'm going to be talking about is memorialization and commemoration, which presents opportunities for members of a school or community to take an active role in constructing an enduring memory related to a crisis. And as was mentioned, I'm going to talk about this more generally, but I hope during the discussion session we can focus more on how it applies to our current context of the pandemic. What I'm going to be covering is the benefits of memorialization and the considerations in planning for activities in school in general, then some of the challenges related to implementation in the school settings. Then I'm going to turn to more specific issues, including the timing of activities and the handling of spontaneous memorials, balancing the desires of families of victims with those of broader school community, remembering the goal of memorialization efforts, and recognizing the 1 year mark. I will then review some of the specific advantages and disadvantages of particular activities that are often used for commemoration memorialization in general. And then I'm just going to end with a brief introduction of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, which can serve as a resource for technical assistance and consultation after a school crisis event. Now, as I mentioned, memorial and commemorative activities help children to express and cope with difficult feelings that might otherwise seem more overwhelming to deal with by themselves, to realize that they're not alone in having fears and concerns, and to learn from others how to cope with troubling feelings and have the chance to share their coping techniques. As a group, they increase their understanding of and adjustment to the event. By planning and taking part in a memorial event, children can exercise at least some control over how they will acknowledge the events, even if they felt powerless to change the event as it was happening. They may also take some control over what and how they wish to honor what was lost or permanently altered. Now, what you plan for a memorial event is actually far less important than how you go about planning it. For memorial events to have meaning for children, the children must be involved actively in the planning, and the event should be relevant to their interests and their developmental needs. School staff should engage students in a discussion of what they would like to remember and what would be the best way they feel to acknowledge the events. And adults should avoid the temptation to tell children what they should be feeling or how they should express those feelings. It's actually far better to ask them and then listen to their responses. Simply put, a commemorative activity or memorial planned by adults for children is more likely to be helpful to the adults than it is to the children. For example, if you were at a meeting and someone had announced that there was a plan that all of you at the end of the meeting would be permitted to take part in an activity to plant flowers in a commemorative garden, and you were then told as soon as you walked out that there were plants waiting for you, there were shovels, there was dirt, and that you were expected to dig a garden wherever that meeting was being held. Chances are that would not be what you wanted to do. It's not that planting a garden is a bad thing to do. It's just it didn't come from the participants. To give you an example from my own children's experience, we were living in a community deeply impacted by 9/11. Actually, one of my daughter's friends had a mother who commuted to the World Trade Center. They came home on one Friday afternoon and told me that there was a plan made by one of the secretaries in the school office that all the kids on Monday morning would wear an outfit with red, white, and blue. Unfortunately, they told me they didn't have any outfit that had red, white, and blue, and at least this was their opinion, those colors don't go well together, except on the American flag. So that then led to a discussion of how I was supposed to take them to the mall to buy one of those outfits, but I was also planning the response or participating in planning the response for the state of Connecticut at the time, so I told them I did not have time to do that. That led to more distress among my kids and some belief that if they were to show up at school improperly dressed, they would be unpatriotic and showing a lack of concern for what had happened. I can assure you that that plan might have been a good idea, but it wasn't one that came from my children or from my family, and as a result, it only caused problems, it didn't help them. Now, in contrast, thoughtful memorial responses that evolve out of an ongoing discussion of those who were impacted by the crisis about how they most wish to remember the victims should instead be encouraged and facilitated. Often these efforts rely on symbolic activities that are meaningful and expressive and therefore tend to be more therapeutic for the survivors. So I'm going to give you a common example and show you how it was handled in two different elementary schools. In both situations, a student had died at a young elementary grade of either natural causes or accidental causes. And in both situations, the class was struggling with what to do with the child's desk. The classes did not want it removed, but they also didn't want the desks to remain. And these were two completely independent events at two different schools. So in one school, what they did was they talked about what they were thinking, um, and what they wanted to do. And actually, they talked about the fact that they didn't feel it would be useful to have the student's desk remain identified because no one wanted to sit at it. But they also didn't want to remove the desk because they felt that symbolically the student was still part of the class. So what they chose to do after some discussion was on a Friday afternoon to take their belongings out of their desk and place it on their chairs. And then the custodians came in that evening or over the weekend. They scrubbed the surfaces of the desks and randomly reassorted them. And the children then took whatever desk was in front of their chair on Monday morning. That way they were able to continue to have the presence of the desk there without anyone feeling uncomfortable sitting at it. Another class came up with a different solution that I think was equally good. They talked about what they admired about the student and what they wanted to remember about him. And one of the things that he was strong at was his ability to read, and this was a second or third grade class. And so what they decided to do was to take his desk and put it in the back of the room and to place books on it. When the children had completed their seat work, they were invited, if they wished, to go to the back of the room and to take a book and to sit at this child's desk and to emulate his reading ability and to honor him. Now, in both situations, these were simple interventions that required no money, but instead required some thought and discussion with the students. So adults should have these conversations with students. Now, they still need to mediate and guide the discussions to ensure that all the stakeholders, the students, the staff, family members, and others, are able to contribute their views, and importantly, that the decisions both follow best practice and align with the children's interests and needs. Schools that instead rely on formal means of memorialization, such as the placement of plaques in the hallway, for example, may inadvertently establish a precedent. And at times of subsequent deaths of students or staff, people may question why similar memorial activities were not instituted for them as well. For example, the friend of a child who dies of cancer may question why more was done for a child who died from gunfire. Classmates of a student who died by suicide or drug overdose may question why the death of their peer was not similarly acknowledged. Formal memorials such as statues, particularly when they are placed in a central location, may also serve as traumatic reminders. Meaningful, symbolic, and respectful memorializations can instead be developed and implemented consistently for individual losses that impact the school community. Having said all of this, teachers and other school staff may be uncomfortable with open-ended discussions of sensitive topics where emotions and coping skills to deal with those emotions may vary among students and the staff and may be based on personal experiences and feelings. Teachers and administrators often worry that memorial events and their discussions about planning of these efforts will upset their students or themselves. The reality, of course, is that it's the crisis events themselves that were upsetting. The discussion simply allows teachers to observe the underlying distress. So while the memorial events may not cause distress themselves, children may nonetheless exhibit distress, and that's distressing to adults. Teachers should therefore notify families prior to memorial events or planning efforts. This will give parents the chance to bring relevant family experiences to the teacher's attention. In many situations, children will be more comfortable beginning the discussions of their feelings related to the crisis within their own families. For those children with known personal losses, it's important to speak with the children prior to the start of any classroom discussions and to inform them what will be discussed within class, and also to reassure them there's no need for them to share their personal experiences or feelings with the class, and no one will disclose their personal experiences. Teachers should ask the children to let them know if anything in the discussion or memorial activity is upsetting. It's also helpful to set up a way for these children to communicate their concerns privately to the teacher during or after class, and to make arrangements so that the children can leave the class discussion or memorial event on their own initiative if they desire to do so. The teacher and parents should check in directly with these children as the planning progresses. Grief is, in many ways, though, a very personal process. Teachers should realize that many children and their families choose not to disclose their personal losses. We did a lot of work with New York City schools after September 11th, 2001. And there were a number of families that actively chose not to notify the school of apparent death in the World Trade Center attack because the children did not want to be identified as one of the 9/11 children. So you should always assume any discussions within classes should be conducted as if there were students who were directly affected, even if none were known to the teacher. The teacher should then remain attentive to children who appear upset by the discussions or the commemorative activities themselves, or who demonstrate signs of agitation, acting out, or other unexpected behaviors. Be sure to prepare other staff within the school as well about likely reactions and how to help children cope. Students and staff may appear resistant to discussing or resisting a crisis event because of the trauma associated with the event itself. A survey that was done 6 months after September 11, 2001 in New York City public schools showed that 6 months after 9/11, 45% of the students, or nearly half, reported they were still trying to avoid thinking, hearing, or talking about it. And this was at about the time we were beginning classroom discussions about the 1-year mark. Mental health professionals may discourage commemorative and memorial events because they worry that these activities will trigger traumatic reminders. But in addition to any trauma experienced by the children, many will have experienced loss, and these activities help them acknowledge and cope with their grief. I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, and one of the parents came to testify at one of the meetings, and she said that at the end of the school year, when her child received the yearbook at Sandy Hook Elementary School, she opened it up and she noticed that the picture of her child who had been killed at that school had been removed, as had the pictures of all the children and staff who died that day. And she questioned, why would anyone do that? It was as if they never existed. Well, although I didn't have the discussion with the school or school district about that decision for the yearbook, I will tell you I have had that discussion with other schools, and I've seen situations where the yearbook staff have been told not to include pictures of anyone that died because they might become traumatic reminders to students. So we have to recognize that commemoration memorialization is another important issue that goes beyond some of the trauma that was experienced. Now, children and adults, even beyond this, may have very different needs and interests related to commemoration. For example, children who had a friend or family member die as a result of a crisis may resent a focus on the heroic efforts of rescue workers. Children who have experienced the death of a family member or friend from an unrelated cause may actually resent all the attention paid to losses associated with the event that is the focus of the commemorative activities. There have been several situations where the shooter was popular and well respected and died by shooting himself, leaving his friends and relatives conflicted on how to grieve his death. In some situations, schools have not allowed the shooter to be remembered or acknowledged in deference to the victims, which is quite understandable, but they have not even permitted the students to express or to discuss their grief related to the shooter's death. I remember in one of these schools, I was talking to one of the teachers, and they had not permitted the students to even acknowledge or talk about the death of the shooter, even though he was very popular and had relatives and friends in the school. And as a result, what they chose to do on the 6-month mark was actually perceived as being quite disrespectful of the deceased, even though that was not the intention of the students. And when I was talking with the teacher, I said, you can't stop children from grieving someone they care about. And he looked at me and he said, you don't understand. I really respected this student and liked him a great deal. Do you know how hard it is for me to talk about this? And I just looked at him and I said, I can only begin to imagine how hard it is for you, but I can assure you it's even harder for his cousins and his siblings and his friends. And we need to figure out how we can provide them that support. Now, those who have different needs should have their views respected. Children who are uncomfortable shouldn't be forced or even coerced to participate in particular activities. Some children who were not as directly impacted by the events themselves may simply not be interested in focusing a great deal of ongoing attention on the event, or even resent having their school experience become defined by the crisis. I remember visiting Las Vegas shortly after the shooting at the concert occurred there. And one of the children told his mother that even though he knew what happened was horrible. To be quite honest, he wasn't at the concert. He didn't know anyone who had died that day or anyone who was related to anyone who had died. And that from his perspective, he actually wasn't impacted by it. And his mother just looked at him and said, you know what, dear, we all have our own way of dealing with our grief and coping with it. And she told me he just looked back at her and said, you're not listening to me, Mom. I'm not coping with my grief. I'm not feeling any grief. He said, I know I can't tell anyone else that because it sounds bad, but that's actually how I'm feeling. And she was so distressed by that she actually paged me because she was concerned there was something wrong with her child. My response was, your child's being honest with you, and I think that's great to see. Now, the apparent disinterest, though, may also be related to a sense by students, as well as staff, that there's nothing that they can do to change either the events that happened or the impact on victims or others within the community. So finding ways for them to help others, which I'll get back to later, even if not related to the specific crisis, can help in their own personal recovery. School staff, administrators, and even school mental health providers who are either personally impacted themselves and or feeling unprepared by virtue of limited training or current resources and supports may opt to avoid addressing crisis events at all for fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. But in reality, saying and doing nothing is precisely the wrong thing. It communicates to children that adults are either unaware of their concerns or unable or unwilling to be of assistance, and it leaves children to deal with their grief and complicated feelings alone. For all these reasons, those of you who are community-based mental health providers, as well as those of you who are school-based mental health providers, can play a vital role by providing assistance and support to school leaders in the aftermath of a crisis event. So let me now turn to some of the specific challenges related to commemoration and memorialization in school settings. And let me begin by talking about timing. Now, frequently, school efforts to initiate formal memorialization activities, such as raising money for a scholarship fund to honor a teacher who has been murdered, may begin within hours or sometimes even minutes of notification. And such premature memorialization diverts energy from addressing the acute psychological and emotional needs, and it leads to the appearance of premature closure of the crisis event, which hinders efforts to promote further adjustment and coping among members of the school community. So at this point, I'm going to pause so that Leora can lead you in a sharing activity.
Thanks, David. And I'm going to give you, so thank you. We're going to take some time to pause and reflect. And during that time, David, I'm actually going to invite you to call back in on your cell phone so that we can kind of take care of some audio issues. Okay, great. So for those of you in the chat box, so David just kind of presented some what to do's and some considerations for memorialization. And I'm just curious if you in the chat box, just like Cecilia's doing and Amy's doing, if you in the chat box might take a pause moment and reflect on maybe one thing that you heard or one thing that struck you in a takeaway from some considerations on commemoration memorialization. So I know that a takeaway that I am struck with is the consideration of wanting to be really mindful of not prematurely moving into memorialization and really thinking about how to respond and then take time to create memory. Yeah, so Cecilia is saying the importance of asking the children what they want to do rather than planning something for them. Absolutely. Yep. And Andrea is saying, similar to suicide prevention, there's kind of a how to manage the fear of discussing these things out versus, and then how to kind of prevent triggering or activating students. Absolutely. Yeah, Ami's noting the importance of not doing anything prematurely. Yeah, Laura, saying and doing nothing is the only wrong way to handle memorialization, right? Do not avoid. So I think, part of us, as Sasha is also reflecting, and Brenda, so part of this is also thinking about, like, what do we need to do and grow in our own comfort with these conversation navigation points in order to hold some of the considerations that David is lifting up. Yeah, Allison is noting To not rush students into memorialization immediately, and noting that death is hard for students to cope with, and to give them time to and reflect and to get their feelings out. Yep, and Malgorzata, we all cope differently. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Amber, also noting to not memorialize too quickly and providing students a level of control when deciding what to do, and realizing that students feel differently and that's okay. Yeah, how important, right? We might have students who don't necessarily have a big reaction, or we might have students that have a really big reaction, just like for us as adults, and how do we actually commemorate and memorialize in a way that holds all of the possibility. Afton, yeah, a way to minimize the stress is to discuss as if every student has had a personal loss. Wow, what a beautiful kind of trauma-informed, assuming that trauma and grief is universal. What a beautiful way to approach that. Thank you, Afton. Yeah, Janine, important to involve students in the planning. So, I think I'm curious as we think about the next pieces when David and Dr. Schoenfeld offers us considerations, like what is this, what could it look like at different stages, right, developmentally for our elementary school students, for our middle school, high school, et cetera, how we might consider even the developmental partnership and planning with students. Okay, we've got so many good thoughts and reflections and takeaways. Yeah, Christina, extending conversations to parents or caregivers, wrapping around as a community to provide mental health education, and everyone has a different experience. Yep, I think one of the biggest pieces that we're kind of reflecting on is how subjective this piece is and how to provide healing access points for so many different experiences. Yeah. A common reaction, Tamara, a common reaction is to do something for the loss rather than processing our feelings, right? So many of us want to fix and want to take care of, and so we want to provide, and what Tamara and many of you are kind of reflecting on is like, what would it look like to kind of like stay in the stick of the grief or of the sadness? Thank you. So David, I'm gonna welcome you back on. We're gonna see if your audio is a little bit better. And then we're going to continue to move forward. And I really appreciate all the reflections. Please continue to put your reflections in the chat box. That really helps us make meaning of the content.
All right. Well, I hope you can hear me better now.
Yes,
so what I want
to
turn to now is to talk about what we refer to as spontaneous memorials. So children and adults, though, often create spontaneous memorials, especially after major events, as one means to express collectively their grief and to offer mutual support to each other. And this should be distinguished from the more formal memorialization efforts, such as the example I gave of a scholarship fund, which aims to establish an enduring memory of a crisis or an individual. Spontaneous memorials are intended to be temporary. Now, while schools often lack input into initiating spontaneous memorials because they do occur spontaneously, they should play a role in managing those that have been established. Ideally, these spontaneous memorials, if they exist at all, should be in a supervised location where students can but don't have to visit. If they're located instead, for example, near the main entrance of the building or in a hallway that students must pass throughout the day, it may be difficult for some students and staff who are particularly impacted. If needed, you can consider relocating the spontaneous memorial, perhaps to a less traveled hallway or to an area of the school property where students do not have to otherwise pass. You should also make sure that it's not a location that will disrupt school activities or become a safety concern, such as if it blocks an emergency exit. Let students know that they should not make any permanent markings on property, such as students' lockers or tables in the room where a mass shooting occurred, or paint messages on walkways or parking lots. Make it clear to students that the spontaneous memorial is temporary, and communicate that the memorial will be removed after a designated time period, for example, within a couple days or at the end of the week. Don't try and remove the items surreptitiously, such as during a scheduled vacation or in the evening, without first notifying people. I've been in situations, particularly after mass shootings, where there have been messages, pictures, large posters that have been sent from all over the country and in fact sometimes from all over the world. And I remember one school where they started placing these up on the wall, and eventually they had covered almost every bare space on every hallway in the school, and then the kids and the staff felt overwhelmed. So they decided they were going to take it down during spring break when the students weren't there. And I explained to them that, these are that they shouldn't be removed when the kids aren't around, but instead maybe they should take digital photos of the spontaneous memorial to create a permanent record before the items are removed. And then those items, you can figure out how to handle those particular items. I remember in one school after this mass shooting, there was actually some discussion of shredding the items and burying them in a time capsule. And I had to actually say to everyone, these are not religious relics. They are messages of support. So you can take pictures of them to remember that the support was offered, but you can dispose of the items, you don't need to shred them and maintain all of the shredding. You want to provide alternative commemorative opportunities and engage students early on in the response efforts, and this may minimize the spontaneous memorials in the first place, and it's particularly important to enlist the students and staff support of efforts to remove the items by reassuring that they'll be involved in future plans for thoughtful and inclusive commemorative and memorial activities. Schools that have been the site of a mass shooting, as I mentioned, should be cautious about displaying all the cards, letters, banners, and pictures sent from throughout the country, because you may get to a situation where it's just overwhelming to the students and the staff. And they then struggle with how to restore a more appropriate school environment without appearing to be disrespectful or denying of what has occurred. Now, off-site memorials that are created independently by students within the community, generally near the location of a death, can be sites where alcohol and drug use and other risk-taking behaviors may occur. Bottles of alcohol, as seen in this picture, and other drug paraphernalia may be found at these sites. I remember being contacted about a student who had died by suicide on a train track, and we were able to recommend right away to the school that they look to see if there is a spontaneous memorial at the location, and if so, to relocate it, and have the location monitored to make sure it does not get reestablished. Having children who are grieving and using alcohol and drugs, often by themselves in a secluded area near a lethal means of suicide, is obviously a risky situation. So anticipating and looking for this, and when present, relocating it, can be an important intervention. Another challenge relates to balancing the needs and desires of families of victims, which may be more interested in frequent, continued, or more intensive memorial and commemorative efforts, with those of the broader school community, which may be trying to actively move beyond the event. One strategy is to try and clarify what each group is trying to accomplish, and often what seems like a conflict can be reframed as different ways of trying to accomplish the same goal, remembering and honoring that which was lost or permanently altered. I often recommend to school leaders that they should not tell families what the school can't or won't do, but rather find out why these families want to do something in particular, and then look together for another way to achieve the goal. For example, parents of students killed in a school shooting that I worked with wanted pictures of the deceased students prominently placed in the office near the school entrance. But this was upsetting to staff that would have to view this daily, and found the idea overwhelming. The discussion with the parents of the deceased students showed that they were worried that the children would be forgotten. Once they realized that the students and staff were actively remembering their children in small and meaningful ways on a daily basis. For example, the choir had selected a song that was special to one of the students. The sport team huddled before a game to remember their teammate and to play in the person's honor. So once they knew that was going on, and that the pictures only reminded students and staff of the shooting and the murder that occurred, and not the lives of their children, the parents withdrew their request for the photographs. Remember, the primary goal, though, is to meet the needs of students and staff. If the family of a student or students that died has very strong preferences that continue to conflict with the needs of the students and the staff of the school, then the needs of the student body should prevail. In all the situations I've been involved to, we've never had that conflict continue. So in the vast majority of situations, though, a compromise can be achieved. But we need to remind school leaders that ultimately their responsibility is to their students and staff. We also need to remember the overall goal of memorialization efforts, which is to remember what was lost and what we wish to preserve, rather than to remember the moment or method of that loss. We don't want to memorialize the tragedy so much as what we've lost from the tragedy or subsequently learned from that experience. My recommendation is therefore to minimize traumatic reminders. so that memorial activities that aim to preserve the details of the moment of the tragedy, such as the time of the shooting or bombing, should be reconsidered. For example, holding a moment of silence 1 year later at the exact minute each plane struck the World Trade Center towers may not be as advisable as holding a moment of reflection at a time that fits more appropriately into the school schedule, such as during morning announcements. Let me contrast this with what was done for the moment of silence at Marjory Stoneman Douglas and throughout Broward County at the 1 year mark and as well at the 2 year mark. They decided to hold a district-wide moment of silence each year at 10:17 a.m. The shooting had actually occurred in the afternoon, but a mid-morning hour was selected to accommodate an early dismissal for community services, and 17 minutes past the hour was selected to honor the 17 lives lost. In that way, the time that you pick to do it has the meaning, but it is not a recreation of the traumatic elements of that event. Now, it is true that for some crisis events, it may be important to have current and future generations attempt to understand and remember how a tragedy came about, such as major terrorist attacks or the Holocaust, in order to try and ensure that it doesn't happen again. And this may even take the form of educational presentations or exhibits in museums. But the goal is not necessarily to try to preserve the memory of exactly how it was carried out. I remember hearing, and I think some of you have probably been to, exhibits on the Titanic. And I was hearing about one being held in a children's museum in the state that I lived in. And they talked about the fact that they had an exact replica of certain elements of the Titanic, the dishes that were used there, the menu that was used, the music that was played. And they talked about how they would have a tank with ice water that was exactly the same temperature as the water was when these individuals drowned. And children were able to put their hand in the water and feel what it was like. I didn't really think that was particularly educational because I can tell you that the temperature of the water will be freezing. That is actually known, and I think children realize that. We don't need them to experience what it felt like to be frozen and to die as a result. So I really don't understand why you would have that in a children's museum, but often people are drawn to those types of exhibits. Now, a challenge that also comes up sometime is when an event transitions from a recent shared experience to become a historical event. In schools, school personnel may remain in the school long after students have graduated that were there at the time of the event. And for community-based crises in subsequent years, it is likely that the adults will still have an enduring personal impact by an event that occurred prior to the time their current students were even born. So teachers who are now teaching about the terrorist attacks of September 11th, for example, have that experience where they had a lived experience of the event, but it is a learned experience for children. And this places a particular burden then on the educators. Similar considerations apply to plans related to the 1 year mark. Children and staff are likely to experience a resurgence of feelings associated with the crisis around the time of the 1 year mark. I am avoiding the use of the term anniversary since survivors tell us that the term tends to be associated with celebrations, and therefore they think it disrespectful to use that term. Now, these same things occur at other markers of the passage of time, such as graduation, or on the same date 2 or 3 years later. Coverage in public and social media at the first and subsequent year marks may include photos, video, or sound recordings from around the time of the event that can serve as traumatic reminders. The practice of naming events by their date, which became more prevalent after the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, which is often referred to as simply by the date, 9/11, has likely increased these anniversary reactions. One approach that has proven very successful with schools is to mark the passage of a year with a day of community service. And this builds on the positive role of service learning in schools and allows student and staff to play an active role in helping others at a time that might otherwise remind them of the powerlessness associated with the tragedy. At the 1 year mark after the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, the school district decided to honor the 17 students and staff who died, as well as those who were injured through a day of community service. This was formalized as a district-wide activity prior to the 2nd year mark and named a day of service and love in recognition that the shooting happened on Valentine's Day. Many schools that we have worked with have chosen to invite students as well as family members and school staff to participate in a day of community service on the one-year mark, and in some situations have continued this as a tradition for subsequent years. Again, it's important to invite students and staff to contribute ideas about what types of service would be meaningful to them. It's helpful to identify a range of options that are appropriate and viable, and for younger students, you may wish to present the options and ask them to select. The day of service, though, doesn't need to coincide with the date of the death or crisis. For example, if the death occurred in the winter when community service would be difficult due to weather, consider conducting planning on that day for community service that will happen later in the year at a more accommodating time. So at this point, if you can just share in the chat box, tell us one aha that came up for you so far, and then I will end by talking a little bit more about specific types of commemorative activities.
Thanks, Dr. Schoenfeld. So as you're putting your ahas, right, so this is like oh, this is the thing that I want to remember and I want to tell my colleagues about. You know, part of the other offer is also to think about questions or other pieces that are coming up for you in your practice. So Heidi is mentioning, yes, like remembering to think about other ways to commemorate, memorialize through community service. I know Morgan and Janine is also kind of, oh yes, the impact of the word anniversary. Deborah is lifting up kind of this aha to remember what was lost and what we wish to preserve rather than the moment or the method of loss. That's so beautifully put, Deborah. Thank you. And Johanna is putting, or Joanna, Johanna is putting the love of idea of the day of service and the love to commemorate with the day of anniversary. And Sasha's reminding us to also be very mindful of what the items are, how portrayed, and the use of the word anniversary. So lots of kind of ahas around how our language impacts and how our language also reflects what we are valuing or what we're honoring. I know that an aha that came up for me was, you know, what are we actually wanting to memorialize, right? Are we memorializing the loss, or are we memorializing the life, and how might we do both, but in ways that really reflect the needs of all of the folks in our community? Yeah, Latrice is the aha for Latrice is to not relive the event, but to remember what's being honored. Yep, really powerful. And Amber, the aha to be mindful of offsite memorials and moving them, and how we can also kind of both respect who put what down, and also how to hold on and continue and move forward and through memorials. Yeah, Christina, how to commemorate events appropriately in a way that doesn't force people to relive the event. Yeah, thank you, Christina. And Allison, to be mindful of the word anniversary. Yeah, so that's a big aha that's coming up. Thank you. Feel free to continue to put your ahas as they're coming up for you. Some of us need more reflection time than others. And I'm going to bring it back to Dr. Schoenfeld.
All right, well, thank you. And I appreciate everyone sharing what they've gotten so far out of this. What I wanted to turn now is to go to more of the practical aspects and the advantages and disadvantages of particular or specific activities that are often used for commemoration memorialization. And I want to just pause to acknowledge the contributions of Dr. Tom DeMaria, a colleague that works with me in the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, who assisted with the content of these slides. So let's start out with commemorative shirts, wristbands, and comparable items. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen in schools after a death of a student has occurred. Some of the advantages is they can provide an activity in developing the item to be worn that the children can engage in when they might otherwise feel helpless. It helps children feel solidarity with peers and creates a sense of unity. But there are also some disadvantages. These items may maintain a focus on loss rather than promoting lasting positive memories of the deceased. There may be peer pressure to keep wearing the items longer than desired by individual students, and guilt experienced by some students about special attention being made to someone to whom they may not be personally close. And continuously visible pictures of the deceased may also be a constant and sometimes unwelcome reminder to some students and be distracting during academic activities such as class lessons or exams. Let me turn now to permanent memorials, which would be including plaques and naming of school buildings, rooms, or spaces on campus. This helps children feel that the loss was recognized and important, and it creates a space to publicly share feelings about the loss and for members of the school or broader community to meet to share their grief. But it may also serve as an unexpected reminder of the deceased, especially early on. Some may complain that it makes the campus feel like a cemetery with markers. Permanent memorials also create an obligation for the school or community, depending on the location of the placement, to maintain the memorial indefinitely, even when new students no longer know the person that died, or may even start to question why it exists. It may also create a sense of obligation on the part of the family, with members of the victims of the victims' families to visit and spend time at the site, which they may not wish to do. And permanent memorials create a precedent for the school that may be difficult to continue after subsequent deaths. Living memorials such as gardens, parks, or plantings are often considered. The design and planting can provide an activity that the children can engage in when they would otherwise feel helpless, and once established, they often provide a peaceful and contemplative place where children and adults can go to express their feelings. The death of living memorials, though, may cause distress among survivors. I often recommend that if living memorials are considered, such as planting of trees, that they not be planted in the same number or multiples of the number of people that died. For example, if 3 students died, it may be best to plant, say, 5 trees, so that if one dies, it won't be interpreted as the loss of a marker for one individual's life. Now, there are exceptions to this. I was doing some training for the Flight 93 Memorial outside Pittsburgh. This was the flight that was en route to Washington, D.C. on 9/11, and that was intentionally downed by the passengers to try and prevent another attack like the World Trade Center attack that they had become aware of while they were on the flight. To honor the passengers and the crew members who died, there were 40 trees planted in a large circular path around the memorial, one to represent each of the passenger and crew members who were victims that day. As I was talking with them, I told them that I often recommend against that, because what if one of those 40 trees die? That is then a visual remember that they have lost something to honor one person. And at that point, the person who was in charge of that just looked at me and said, "We are the National Park Service. We maintain trees." They said that they took, very good care of those trees, and that if they noticed anyone was sick or injured, they would replace it with an exact tree of the same species that would be the same age. And they were able to do that and were committed to doing that. But in my opinion, that's the exception that proves the rule, because most schools do not have the National Park Service to maintain their garden. Now, if schools do decide to use living memorials, they should be placed in areas where the school knows they will not need to build in the future, and they should recognize the obligation to maintain the site long term. Sometimes these physical reminders have unanticipated negative connotations to students. For example, if a school within a community with a high rate of violence decides to memorialize the death of students by planting a tree within a peace garden, students may come to see the growing number of trees as more of a body count and a constant reminder that they live in a violent neighborhood, and simply wonder when their own tree will be planted. Often used is posting of messages, such as on posters or on the internet. Now, this may serve as a place for students to publicly share their feelings about the loss and increases a sense of solidarity with others mourning the loss, but it too may serve as an unexpected reminder of the deceased. It needs to be monitored for negative or harmful messages. For example, if used after a student's suicide, if a student anonymously posts a message suggesting a plan for self-harm, unless the site was monitored, it will be impossible to identify and get needed support to that individual. Such messages also need to be removed so as not to encourage self-harm for others. Negative messages, such as statements suggesting retaliation or highly critical statements about the deceased, are also problematic. It's often unclear how long it should remain posted and what is done with whatever is created. And competition among students who contribute comments and even possible retribution about what is written or posted is sometimes seen. Now, social media and cyberspace are increasingly being used for commemoration memorialization. This was done prior to the pandemic and is likely to be something you will see a lot more of during the pandemic. Continuing to post messages to the deceased's personal site or creating a new site may occur. Schools should be aware of widely used and visited sites and should seek information about what is communicated at these sites, such as by speaking with student representatives. The goal is not to police the site, but rather to maintain a level of awareness similar to that of the student body. And you should ask students to bring to an adult's attention any comments that are worrisome or destructive, such as suicidal or homicidal intentions communicated by a student or highly critical comments that are being posted. In a similar manner, a scrapbook, letters, or drawings may be used to collect student input. This helps children share their feelings about the loss, and it creates a permanent record that can be given to surviving family members. You need to identify someone to hold on to what was created in the event the family is not ready yet or interested in receiving it. Whatever is created should be carefully reviewed before sharing with the family to ensure that the comments are appropriate to the family members. Children may feel shame also or regret in the future about what was expressed by them during a time of particular vulnerability. And lastly, money may be raised for a scholarship or a fund in the name of the deceased. This helps children perform an activity, fundraising, which may help them when they feel less powerless, may make them or help them feel less powerless. It's less likely to disrupt community activities as might some of the other options, and it does focus on the life rather than the death of the person. Children generally, though, don't earn the money that's collected, so therefore this may not feel as meaningful to them as it might to the adults. If not established as an endowment, there's a need to continue fundraising, which can become increasingly difficult as time passes, unless people in the school community who have experienced the impact of the loss directly, or even remember the individual or individuals who died, may still be alive or present in the school community. You may also need to consider how to involve the family of the deceased, both initially and over time, so that their role is meaningful to them and well received by the students and staff. And you need to consider how to honor the memory of the deceased each time the award or scholarship is given. This also creates a precedent that may be difficult to follow with subsequent deaths. If it's done only for popular or successful students, or only those who may have affluent friends and family, it will create an obvious inequity after other deaths. So let me just end the webinar before we go to questions and discussion by just introducing the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement and the Coalition to Support Grieving Students resources. The National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement was established in 2005 with funding from the September 11th Children's Fund and the National Philanthropic Trust, and our core funding is now provided by the New York Life Foundation. And the center was created to promote an appreciation of the role that schools can serve to support students, staff, and families at times of both crisis and loss, to enhance the training of individuals in school-related professional education programs in the areas of crisis and loss, and to serve as a resource for information, training materials, consultation, and technical assistance. And the initial consultation and technical assistance we provide at no cost to the school. Through an interdisciplinary team of medical, mental health, and school professionals, the National Center provides confidential on-site and remote technical assistance and consultation for school leadership and school professionals, including related to commemoration memorialization. We have a we provide practical and timely advice via a 24/7 toll-free number and email address, which I'll share with you. And we offer ongoing support in both the immediate aftermath of a crisis and throughout the long-term recovery period. We also provide educational resources and crisis management tools that can be freely downloaded from our site. And we also offer school staff training and community presentations and professional development for a range of professional audiences. Further information about the center and its resources can be found at the center's website, which is schoolcrisiscenter.org. And this last site just gives you information about how to contact us through our toll-free number, as well as our website. And you can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn accounts. And this slide shows you the Coalition to Support Grieving Students online materials. We have a specific COVID-19 Pandemic Response Resources webpage, as well as a handout for supporting grieving students during the pandemic, which is a guide to using the coalition to support grieving students material. So at this point, I'm going to open it to questions and discussions and turn this back to Leora. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to move us back to the Q&A visual. So while you are, so first of all, again, thank you. That was really, really important content. And this is from the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. And we also know that many of you on the line have your own lived experience, leadership, and personal in navigating memorialization and commemoration. And so if you have your learning lessons and your advice, disadvantages, advantages, please feel free to put in the chat box. While you put your questions in, I got one question sent to me, David, so we can get it started off, which was that at the very beginning we talked a lot about planning with students. It was one of your first points. And a question to me was if you can give examples of how to plan with students, considerations across the developmental spectrum. We'll get it started off there.
Certainly. So I actually recommend that the discussions be conducted by classroom teachers who already have knowledge of the students, have a relationship with them, and are comfortable in their development and have a sense of their developmental level and their interests and needs. And it may be facilitated by a school mental health provider as well, who can assist the teacher. The example that I gave of the desk in the classrooms, I think they were both around second or third grade students. So you'll find that even very young children can come up with some excellent ideas if you guide them in the discussion. When you're talking with middle school and high school students, often then you can ask to speak to either student leaders or other people who have been elected to represent the whole high school, for example, the classes, and have a conversation with them as a group, and then ask them how to bring the input from the rest of the student body forward. And then, of course, I would speak more directly with family members of the victims for their input. But one of the cautions I do make is you're not asking the victims' families to tell you what you should do. You're asking them to give a general sense of what's important to them. So, for example, when I talked after a mass shooting, the families were trying to figure out what would happen at the 1-year mark, and I was talking to there were a large number of students and staff who had died, and many of the families just said, we don't expect to be there on the 1-year mark. We probably won't be able to come. But all that we ask is that the students be reminded of the reason for the 1-year mark, and that is to remember our children and our spouses. So I think you can ask them generally what they would like, and then you can show how that was being met. In this case, the names of the victims were read aloud at the school site at the 1-year mark. But you're not asking, I see sometimes it actually implied that you're asking the family to tell you, of the victims, to tell you what should be done. Instead, you should be just their general sense.
Thank you. And I put 2 more questions in our presenter chat box on your right if you want to check those out. And I will add to that question that as a former classroom teacher, that when we had students that were killed due to gang-related gun violence, for us as 11th grade teachers, we actually created a project-based learning cross-curricular unit for our students to study the impact of the kind of causes, root cause analysis, social determinants, and construction of gun violence, so that there was a curricular efficacious engagement with the subject. Of course, this wasn't immediately after the death of our students, but was ongoing, and so it was another way to make meaning of the experience that students were having, but through content, curriculum, and pedagogy. So just wanted to offer that as from a teacher perspective. So I wanted to lift up, David, maybe we can go to the question that Johanna brought up around, are these recommendations also related and specific or contextual for death by suicide? And maybe we can kind of broaden that question with how might different types of death kind of interact with different types of commemoration and memorialization?
Sure. So one of the concerns after suicide, as well as some other types of death that for example, drug overdoses or driving under the influence of alcohol, you don't want to honor the means of death or encourage students to consider it, particularly in situations of suicide, as a way to get notoriety, so that individuals who feel very marginalized or unheard should not be brought to think that if they kill themselves, they will finally be heard. So that's why you don't want to glamorize or make too much attention to the means of death. Having said that, though, if you do want to acknowledge that a member of the school community has died and that has impact on those who are grieving, because that is also not a good message for someone who is feeling marginalized and devalued, that in fact a child can die and nobody actually cares or even says anything. That makes them feel even more marginalized and devalued. So the goal is to not use some of these more formal methods, such as scholarship funds or plaques, because we don't want to value a person's life based on how they died or devalue them on the way that they died. So if it is instead a thoughtful and symbolic recognition of what was lost by the person who is no longer present, that can be used in suicide as well. So if the same discussion I talked about with the death, that could occur if a child died by suicide, to still say that they still honor that the student was part of their group, but it doesn't leave some lasting permanent memorial to the individual that died by suicide. I remember talking to one mother, this was not a case of suicide, but it was drug overdose. And her daughter, according to her, was a teenager who had never experimented or used drugs. She was with friends and she was given one pill. And she apparently took the pill, knowing that it was, she knew she was taking a drug that she shouldn't have, but she was just trying one dose. And she had an idiosyncratic reaction to it and died. And the mother was trying to encourage the school to do something at the graduation ceremony to honor her child who was not able to attend because of her death. And the school was unwilling to do that because it was a death through a drug overdose. And she called the local media and complained about it. And the reporter said to her, "Look, ma'am, if your child had been shot and killed, I would do the story, but your child died by a drug overdose, so I'm not going to do it." And she just called me up in tears and just said, "My daughter made one mistake. Is her life now worth no value?" And, I talked with her about the fact that calling the media is not going to help the situation because you really need to partner with the school, and I explained the school's perspective. And then she cried more and she said, "I should never have done that. I wanted to be at the graduation, but now I realize I'm not ready to be there and I shouldn't be attacking the school." And we talked about other ways of handling it. So I think it just has to be done with sensitivity. But I do think that suicides need to be acknowledged, that they occurred, but more so that a death occurred and that there's been a loss in the community. I also noticed there were a lot of questions about what to do during the pandemic. So let me address that, because I've been getting those questions from a number of schools. This is sometimes when the death is related to the pandemic, such as they've been more typically parents who have died, or a school principal or a teacher who has died due to COVID-19. But in many situations, it's just what do you do when a student has died from, say, an accidental cause that's unrelated to the pandemic, but you can't bring students together. Now, you can't bring students together in person. And some of the techniques like using wristbands and things like that are not going to be something that would be feasible when people are sheltering in place. But you can bring them together through virtual means. And I've actually seen this done even prior to the pandemic. I worked with one, or I've been contacted by one exchange program between the US and Israel. And they had spent a summer, I think, in Israel, and the US students returned to their schools. And then after that, shortly thereafter, one of the students died. And they held a virtual memorial that brought together the children from Israel and from the United States, where they talked about the student who died and what they felt about that, and told stories about him during a live online memorial. And we're seeing increasing examples of virtual memorials that sometimes are even sponsored by funeral homes or can be on social media sites. So I'm encouraging schools to use virtual means for notification as well as for discussion among students. And they can still do activities or consider how to provide service even without leaving their homes. It may be that they write letters to families or to individuals in nursing homes, or they send cards to children's hospitals, or they do something else to figure out how to help family members or community members in ways that are still safe and protective of their own health, but allow them to, as a community, acknowledge and remember someone that they lost. I realize that this is more challenging, but to be honest, a lot of these same approaches are used during summer vacations and during winter breaks when schools are not in session, and often deaths do occur during that time, and they have successfully used some of these virtual means.
Thanks. I think that that's a really important piece to remember, that's kind of always or now, right? Like how in other times where we have not been school building based, what approaches and strengths and resources have we engaged with in commemoration and memorialization that we can learn from and adapt and grow now. And so I appreciate that reminder. And so we've got a little bit more time. I want to lift up two different conversation points. One is a conversation around how to provide support to avoid burnout from Mabel, and I think I'm going to broaden that question to something that you and I have talked a lot about in our own practice, but how do we support and provide and maintain our own sustenance and sustainability when we're navigating supporting educators, when we're navigating responding to student death, and prevent our own burnout and our own overwhelmation of grief. I don't think that's a word, but I've decided to make it one. So maybe if we can take some time thinking about that from a practitioner space, and then we'll move into two more.
Okay, so in terms of thinking about how to avoid burnout, or sometimes it's also referred to as compassion fatigue, this is actually something I plan on covering in the next webinar that deals with bereavement, because I thought that was the more appropriate context for it. But to summarize some of the things, if you connect with individuals and provide compassionate care, it really requires, first off, empathy, which is a sense of understanding the person's distress. But if you are being empathic and providing compassionate care, compassion goes beyond empathy. Compassion involves having empathy to understand their experience, but compassion means you also share with a desire to help them through the experience by sharing their distress. So compassion actually, as in two words in Latin, the roots are to share together or to suffer together. So that often is followed with people talking about the risk of compassion fatigue, which tends to suggest that somehow compassion is inherently limited, that you have a certain amount of compassion, and if you use it too much or care too much, it will be exhausted and you will be exhausted. And that's not actually the case. I liken it to exercise, that when you first exercise, it is very tiring, but then you build up your capacity for subsequent exercise. And that can actually be energizing for individuals who exercise regularly. At least that's what I've been told by other people who exercise regularly. I'm not being one of them. The same thing, though, happens with compassionate care, and that it is exhausting to begin with, but it actually builds our capacity and our reserves to give more compassion and to care more, and that it actually decreases burnout. They've found that individuals who provide compassionate care have a higher meaning to the work that they do, and that therefore provides it protects from burnout, because the work that you're doing is difficult, but it has meaning. And that meaning making is important to actually prevent burnout. So I think what you have to do is then be aware of the impact it has on you. I always tell people, don't give any more of yourself than you wish to give. And it may be that sometimes you can't give much, or you may not be able to give as much as someone might request of you. And you need to protect yourself, so that you have the capacity to continue to help others. So always be conscious of what you are giving. And if it is a time where you're stressed, maybe because you've had a personal loss yourself, or the loss experience is too close to something you've experienced in your own life, or that you're worried about, then you bring in someone else to assist you with providing that care. It is not our obligation to provide all care to everyone, but as professionals, we should try and make sure the care is provided to those who need it, but doesn't have to be provided by us. And there are a range of other professional self-care strategies, which I can talk about if people have specific questions, or talk about it at the next presentation in more detail if there's interest.
Thank you. And I think that part of, Mabel, part of what I wonder if you're also bringing up that I know is a shared curiosity point. It's something that David mentioned around the power of meaning making, right? And that meaning making is a way that we, as all humans, regulate and we feel like we're able to actually access healing and not just coping. And I think it's an invitation for many of us who are system leaders at the county or district or state is to consider the importance of affirming and not silencing or disenfranchising, but affirming when a death happens. I know that many schools that I have worked in, and I know this is a shared experience, where someone dies and we move on as though business as usual, or we don't acknowledge, or we maybe acknowledge for students, but we don't acknowledge for the educator. And I think that what David is bringing up, particularly as it relates to burnout prevention and compassion fatigue support, is the actual vital, central importance to naming, affirming, and providing support to all the different concentric circles of care. So not just asking folks on the line to provide for their students, but then ensuring that those who are providing for their students are also provided for. So I'm really grateful that you named that, David, and also named the importance between compassion fatigue and burnout and satisfaction. So I think we have time for one last question, and then we're going to move into close. And Eric was bringing up earlier a question around like a specific memorial that really stands out. I know, David, you've got years and years of witnessing and supporting schools navigating memorials. And so the question was kind of, out of all of that, what is a specific memorial that really stands out to you in terms of effectiveness, maybe thinking about both short-term and then also long-term?
Well, I think for short-term and simple, I do still talk about those elementary school classes that decided what to do with their classmates' desk. And that was probably about 25 to 30 years ago, and it still stands out for me because it seemed so simple and yet so meaningful, and was selected by the students themselves. But I guess what I have found to be most effective, and now what I recommend fairly consistently, and to be quite honest, virtually every school that I've spoken to has embraced the idea and done it, is the day of community service. The service does not need to be linked to the cause of the death. So if it's a death by suicide, it isn't necessarily that they have a speaker on suicide, because that may be a very difficult time for them to hear presentations on it. Or the same thing with gun violence. Sometimes it can become politicized if it's done immediately afterwards. But doing some service, helping others, providing assistance to others. I mean, we see that even after some of the worst, genocides that occur and people are are displaced, and the children still try and make makeshift toys for the younger children. The doing for others and helping others can give you a sense of agency and voice, and the ability to feel that you can contribute, that often makes people feel better about their situation and themselves. And so I've actually seen that consistently used in schools, to the point where, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, for example, they did this at schools in that zone the first year, and they involved the community, and they actually had already identified projects that aligned with the interests of each of the 17 victims. For example, I think one child liked the beach, so they did a beach cleanup. And everyone got involved from the community, and it became such a meaningful day of service that it actually was decided to be done by the second year at all schools across the district. They have about 275,000 students. It's one of the largest school districts in the country. And they've decided that it will be a half day going forward. And they've made this commitment to provide ongoing service learning to students because they found it such a meaningful experience. And I had the opportunity to be there for the first and second year mark. And I will tell you that there was a degree of unity and coming together in that community where there was no criticism that anyone told me about of anyone about anything that day. People, and all I kept thinking was, could they just do this the other 364 days out of the year? I mean, I think people can really come together in healing and memorialization and commemoration that really makes them uplifting days. So I will tell you, I've already booked open the time for the third year mark because I want to be there. And I also think it's helpful to be there.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to move into close. You just heard me take a big inhale and exhale. I encourage you to do the same, not only to you, David, but also to folks on the line. I know that Dr. Schoenfeld introduced the NCSCB and the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. We really hope that you access the resources that he and colleagues have really thoughtfully and intentionally prepared over the course of years, and the always and the now. I want to name that we at the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, we've got a couple upcoming learning opportunities that can support the extension of this conversation. The first is that we've got a readiness, response, and recovery after school tragedy guide coming out. There's also, we've got a brief kind of compilation of resources, some of which Dr. Schoenfeld contributed to, so you can access it. You can click on the hyperlink when you download the PDF. We also have a couple other things coming out. One is that we've got a crisis readiness, response, recovery, and renewal school mental health leadership guide coming out soon. So that's hopefully coming out in May to help you navigate all the different aspects of this work, including grief response, recovery, and other aspects of that navigation. And then we're also going to be talking about how to support the interconnected systems framework, how to use that framework in the time of pandemic and school closure. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be able to get all of this content and information. Many of you, so Mabel asked about burnout and support. We want to name that we've got a, every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we have Wellness Wednesdays hosted by the Meaning Makers Collective. You can tell that we really believe in meaning makers, because meaning making, so we partner with the Meaning Makers Collective. So every Wednesday, 2 to 3, it's just a time for you as educators to just be and get the support that you need, where you don't have to provide anything for anyone else, but just get kind of space held for yourself. And then the other piece that I want to list, because it's connected to this conversation, is in April, the end of this month, we'll be having a session on planning for school crises during crisis, which many of you might relate to. So, and that's with Dr. Stephen Brock and Yasmina Lusinger from Arizona Department of Education. Dr. Brock is with the California State University of Sacramento. And of course, we hope that you continue to join us in May with Dr. Schoenfeld and in August. And I just want to name that in a little bit, you're going to get a survey that we really need you to respond to so that we can continue this work. But I want to name that we have space to provide more contextual support. So I know Brenda and Andrea and a couple other of you have COVID-19 specific questions. And so if you have sessions or topics that you're interested in getting more extension, either related to COVID or maybe something came up during this conversation that you'd like more support with, please let us know. And Dr. Schoenfeld and I will work together to make sure that that happens for you to support your leadership and your response. So please access us by Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram, all the things. I want to close by giving a really big thank you to Dr. Schoenfeld and the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. You can't see me, but I'm doing lots of hand waving. And I also want to invite you in the chat box to just name a word of what you are leaving this conversation with. So many of us move from conversation to conversation to conversation, and it really helps our own regulation to punctuate so that we can transition. So we've got some gratitude happening, lots of hope happening. And I know that I am thankful. Mabel is saying compassionate and courage. See a couple other words that are coming up for you. Yeah, mindfulness, meaning is so important. Absolutely. Paul, difficult but meaningful. Yep, that is potentially what I hope to be my lifelong motto. Thank you for naming that. Yes, lots of gratitude. So in a couple minutes, we're going to close, and you'll get a survey in your inbox for you to complete. We really hope that you do so we can continue this work. Again, we're grateful to Dr. Schoenfeld for providing this, and we hope to see you in an upcoming webinar, upcoming discussion, and hopefully in person during a training soon. So thank you. And Joanne, we're going to wait just a couple more minutes for folks to finish the chat box, and then we can close and the survey can start. Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, and thank you. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join today in the middle of all of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think we are good. So again, we wish you a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are. Take some time for yourself, lots of hydration, maybe a little shoulder stretch, exhale, and we're here for you in any way that you need. David, again, gratitude, and Joanne, with that, we are going to close today's session on principles of commemoration and memorialization. Thank you so much. Be well, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.